ga ik projecten ondersteunen. Eentje in Zuid-Limburg, de ander in Zuid-Spanje.
In a country where royalty had long been wrapped in restraint, one of the most unsettling images did not come from a balcony, a coronation, or a state portrait. It came from a princess, going public against her own world. In 2003, Princess Margarita of Bourbon-Parma and her husband, Edwin van Zuydewijn, stepped into the press with allegations that sounded less like family tension and more like institutional warfare. They claimed they had been shut out, smeared, monitored, and quietly crushed by the very royal circle that was supposed to stand above scandal. What had once looked like a difficult marriage inside a sensitive family suddenly began to resemble something far darker, a private feud turning into a national spectacle. The shock was not only in what they said, but in what officials were later forced to admit. The Dutch government acknowledged that, around the time of the couple's intended marriage, information had in fact been gathered on Edwin by security services. At the same time, later reporting made clear that some of the most explosive claims, including the allegation of wiretapping, were not borne out in the way the couple had suggested. That tension is what made the affair so combustible. This was not a simple story of palace gossip, and it was not a clean story of innocence either. It sat in that far more dangerous space between confirmation and denial, humiliation and revenge, private grievance and public consequence. So, what really happened between Princess Margarita and Edwin van Zuydewijn? Why did this marriage provoke such visible discomfort inside the Dutch royal family? And how did a relationship that began as a personal choice end up exposing cracks in the image of an entire monarchy? To understand that, we have to go back to the couple the public thought it knew. Before the accusations, before the television interviews, before the marriage became a national argument, Princess Margarita and Edwin van Zuydewijn could still be framed as something far simpler, a royal woman choosing love on her own terms. Margarita was not a distant socialite drifting near the monarchy by accident. She was the daughter of Princess Irene, herself the sister of Queen Beatrix, and therefore part of a family that carried both glamour and constitutional sensitivity. In the Dutch imagination, that mattered. Relationships around the royal family were never purely private. They were read for symbolism, stability, and signals about the institution itself. That was part of the fascination. Edwin was not a prince, not a court figure, and not someone shaped by the careful choreography of royal life. He arrived as an outsider with ambition, confidence, and a manner that did not seem naturally built for a family sustained by protocol and controlled distance. On paper, the relationship had the ingredients of a modern royal romance. A woman from one of Europe's most recognizable dynasties choosing a man from outside that world. To some, it looked independent. To others, it looked risky from the beginning. When they married in 2001, the union should have settled the question. Instead, it quietly sharpened it. Because even before the scandal exploded, the public image was never fully at ease. The wedding did not carry the easy warmth or institutional embrace people often associate with royal approval. Reports at the time noted that senior members of the Dutch royal family were absent, including Queen Beatrix, and that the marriage was already overshadowed by visible discomfort over Edwin himself. That absence mattered. In a monarchy built on coded gestures, who does not attend can say almost as much as who does. What might have been presented as a love story already carried the atmosphere of a relationship being tolerated at best, resisted at worst. And so the first signs were not dramatic. They were colder than that. There was distance where there should have been welcome. There was unease where there should have been celebration. And hanging over the couple was the sense that the public was looking at a marriage that had been forced to defend itself long before it had the chance to simply exist. Long before the country heard the allegations, the fracture had already begun to show in outline. The only question was how far it would spread. The real pressure in this story did not begin with a headline. It began with the structure around the relationship itself. Princess Margarita was not just a woman from a well-known family making a personal choice. She was the daughter of Princess Irene and the niece of Queen Beatrix, part of a dynasty in which even those outside the very center of power still carried symbolic weight. In the Dutch system, there is a formal distinction between the royal house and the wider royal family, but that does not make such relationships invisible. It simply means the boundaries between the personal and the institutional are more delicate than they appear from the outside. That mattered because the Dutch monarchy does not operate like an ordinary private household with famous relatives. Under the constitution, the monarch exists within a framework of ministerial responsibility, meaning ministers are politically responsible for what the monarch says and does. In practice, that creates a culture in which discretion is not just a matter of taste, it is part of how the institution protects itself. Image, proximity, protocol, and public consequence are tightly bound together. So, when tension formed around Margarita's marriage, it was never likely to remain just an awkward family disagreement. In a monarchy built on restraint, even discomfort can become constitutional in tone. For Edwin, that made his position unusually vulnerable from the start. He was not shaped by palace instinct, not buffered by royal legitimacy, and not protected by the quiet codes that govern who belongs and who merely enters the room. Around the time of the intended marriage, information was gathered about him by the security services, something later acknowledged in an official AIVD letter. That confirmation did not prove every allegation the couple would later make, but it changed the emotional balance of the story. Edwin was no longer simply an outsider facing skeptical in-laws. He was a man who could plausibly feel that an entire system had begun to close around him before the marriage had even settled into place. And for Margarita, the pressure ran in two directions at once. To remain loyal to her family might have meant accepting distance, disapproval, and silence. To stand beside her husband meant pushing back against a royal culture that survives by never appearing to lose control. That is what gives this story its deeper tension. It was not only a romance under strain, it was a relationship forced to live inside a world where status carried meaning, gestures carried messages, and private hurt could quickly begin to look like public rebellion. By the time the visible cracks started spreading, the emotional terms of the conflict had already been set. At first glance, the relationship seemed to carry the appeal that royal stories often do when they look modern enough to feel intimate and old enough to feel symbolic. Princess Margarita was choosing a man from outside the protected rhythm of court life, and that alone gave the relationship a charge. It suggested independence. It suggested conviction. It suggested that, in a family built on tradition and unreadable silences, she was willing to follow her own instincts. But the problem with this kind of romance is that what feels brave in public can feel deeply destabilizing inside the institution itself. By the time they married in France in September of 2001, the relationship was already surrounded by visible discomfort. Neither Queen Beatrix nor Margarita's father attended the wedding, and the absence was impossible to miss. In royal life, rejection does not always arrive in raised voices. Sometimes it arrives in who stays away. That was the first crack. Not scandal, not yet, but a marriage entering the world already burdened with the feeling that it had not truly been blessed. Edwin de Roy van Zuydewijn did not step into the Dutch royal orbit as someone quietly absorbed into its codes. He stepped into it under suspicion. The official line later made clear that information had been gathered about him around the time of the intended marriage as part of what authorities described as regular security practice. But whatever the bureaucratic explanation, the emotional effect would have been harder to manage. A man already viewed warily by the family now had reason to believe he had been treated not as a future relative, but as a problem to be examined. A relationship that might have survived ordinary family disapproval was instead being shaped by mistrust from above and defensiveness from within. From there, the strain appears to have deepened in ways that were quieter than the later headlines, but perhaps more important. According to reporting at the time, Margarita felt that her husband was being ignored by members of the royal family and by those around them. She later described a world in which he was treated as if he were not really there, not fully acknowledged, not fully accepted. Just months after the wedding, she appealed to then Prime Minister Wim Kok, asking in effect for intervention, hoping the Queen might be persuaded to force some form of acceptance. That alone says a great deal about the state of the marriage's atmosphere. Newlyweds are supposed to be building a life together. Here, the effort already seemed to involve negotiating for legitimacy, not from the public, but from within the family itself. And this is where the relationship began to change shape. What may once have felt like loyalty between husband and wife started to harden into something more defensive and more dangerous. A shared sense of being cornered. The more Edwin appeared to feel watched, doubted, or undermined, the more Margarita seems to have moved from trying to bridge the gap to taking his side against her own world. That shift matters because once a royal relationship becomes organized around resistance, every gesture begins to carry more weight. A missed invitation is no longer just an awkward omission. A cold room becomes evidence. A hesitation becomes a message. The couple were not simply living under pressure from the press. They were living inside a conflict in which status, access, and emotional allegiance were being tested at the same time. The warning signs, then, were not hidden at all. They were there, in the wedding itself, in the absences, in the need for political intermediaries, in the sense that the marriage was being forced to defend its right to exist before it had been given the chance to settle. What made the fracture spread was not one dramatic betrayal, but the accumulation of coldness, control, and mutual suspicion. By the time the public would hear the couple speak out in detail, the relationship was no longer just under strain. It had become the front line of a larger struggle between private devotion and royal containment. And once that happened, it was only a matter of time before the whole conflict burst into view. The point of no return came when the couple stopped treating the conflict as a private wound and turned it into a public accusation. In 2003, Princess Margarita and Edwin the Roy van Zuydewijn began speaking openly in a series of interviews with Harpe, De Tide, and what they described was not a difficult relationship with disapproving relatives, but a campaign of humiliation, obstruction, and surveillance. They said Edwin had been monitored, that files had been built around him, that his business had been damaged, and that the family's hostility had extended far beyond coldness or social snubs. For a country unaccustomed to seeing the Dutch monarchy dragged into open scandal, the effect was immediate. This was not gossip leaking from the margins. It was the Queen's own niece stepping forward and tearing open the image from the inside. What made the affair so gripping was the scale of what the couple were willing to say. The allegations were not confined to Edwin's treatment or to tension around the marriage. Margarita spoke on national television and in print about abuse of position, about what she portrayed as snobbery, exclusion, and deeper moral hypocrisy inside the family. The story widened fast. It was no longer only about whether Edwin had been unfairly judged. It became a broader spectacle about what kind of family the House of Orange really was behind the carefully managed public image. British and international reporting at the time made clear just how startling this felt in the Netherlands, where royal scandal had long been contained by habit, deference, and discretion. Then came the official response, and that was the moment the story changed from emotional drama into something closer to a constitutional embarrassment. Prime Minister Jan-Peter Balkenende was forced to respond publicly after it emerged that, around the time of the couple's intended marriage, information had indeed been gathered about Edwin by the security services. An AIVD letter confirmed that the former BVD and the Royal and Diplomatic Protection Service had collected information and admitted that this had not been properly reflected in earlier replies to the couple. Nos later summarized the core of the scandal even more bluntly. The Queen's cabinet had, without the government's knowledge, asked the intelligence service to look into Edwin's past. That confirmation did not validate every accusation the couple had made, but it destroyed the idea that the whole affair was fantasy or hysteria. Some form of institutional scrutiny had taken place, and that alone was enough to shake the public image of control. But this is also where the story became more complicated and more dangerous. Because the more attention the couple drew, the more important the distinction became between what had been confirmed and what remained contested. Balkenende denied wrongdoing beyond failures of procedure and said he had found no evidence that the couple had been bugged in the way they alleged. Later, an ombudsman investigation concluded that Edwin's broader claim that the government had interfered with his private life and damaged his opportunities was not supported by documents or sworn testimony, even though it was established that information had been sought about him in at least some contexts. That ambiguity kept the affair alive. The couple had not invented the entire conflict, but neither did the public receive one clean revelation that made every accusation true. Instead, the scandal lived in the uneasy space between justified suspicion and claims that could not fully be proven. By then, however, the old image was already gone. The Dutch royal family had tried to respond with restraint, saying it did not recognize the picture being painted and limiting itself to a brief statement. But silence no longer looked dignified. It looked defensive. The spectacle had become too large. A marriage that had once seemed controversial only within a guarded royal circle was now being discussed as a matter of abuse of power, public accountability, and royal image-making. And the couple themselves were changing under the pressure. What may once have been a united front of loyalty and defiance was now bound to the machinery of interviews, legal threats, official letters, and rising public fascination. Once a relationship becomes inseparable from its scandal, it stops being held together by intimacy and begins to be held together by conflict. That was the real turning point. Not simply the allegations, and not simply the government's admission. It was the moment the marriage ceased to be understood as a private bond under pressure and became the vessel carrying an entire national drama. After that, there was no easy return to normality. Even if every claim had been resolved cleanly, the symbolic damage had already been done. The public had seen too much. The monarchy had been forced to answer too much, and Princess Margarita and Edwin de Roy van Zuydewijn had crossed a line from which royal families, and often marriages, rarely recover intact. What followed was not a clean victory for either side. The scandal damaged the monarchy because it forced the Dutch state to admit that Edwin de Roy van Zuydewijn had in fact been investigated around the time of the intended marriage, and Prime Minister Balkenende publicly apologized because the couple had not been informed of that inquiry. But the scandal also damaged Margarita and Edwin themselves, because the more they pushed the story into public view, the more their credibility became tied to claims that could not all be sustained. Later findings made clear that the government had not interfered in Edwin's private life in the sweeping way he alleged, even though the Queen's cabinet had sought information about his work. That left the affair in an uncomfortable middle ground, serious enough to embarrass the state, but too contested to deliver the kind of total vindication the couple seemed to want. The personal cost was even sharper. Nos reported that after the interviews and accusations, Margarita became estranged from her family and was no longer welcome at major royal occasions, including the wedding of Willem Alexander and Maxima and the funeral of Prince Claus. By the time the marriage ended in 2006, the relationship had become entangled with legal conflict, media fatigue, and a sense of public unraveling that neither side could control. Later coverage described the divorce itself as chaotic, with missing personal papers, changing lawyers, and renewed press attention. In other words, the scandal did not simply wound the marriage from the outside. It entered the marriage and became part of its internal collapse. And then the balance shifted. Margarita gradually repaired her ties with the royal family after the divorce, something later confirmed in Dutch coverage, while Edwin remained locked in the long afterlife of the affair. Nos reported that he continued to bring cases, that he received limited damages in some matters, lost in others, and struggled financially for years afterward. The narrative, in the end, was not controlled by the palace, and it was not controlled by the couple either. It became one of those scandals in which everyone loses command of the story. The monarchy could not fully preserve its image of distance and dignity. Margarita could not keep the conflict from consuming her place inside the family. Edwin could not turn public exposure into stable vindication. The story outgrew all of them. That is also why the public response remains so complicated. Some people saw a woman standing by her husband against a cold and powerful institution. Others saw a couple escalating grievance into spectacle. And many simply watched with that mix of fascination and exhaustion that royal scandals so often produce, because the story seemed to reveal something larger than one marriage. It exposed how monarchy, media, and private pain can feed each other until no one is really looking for truth anymore. Only the next contradiction, the next humiliation, the next piece of proof that the perfect image was never perfect at all. What was left behind was not simply a failed marriage. It was a story that changed shape as it aged. In the moment, the affair felt explosive. A princess, an outsider husband, the Dutch monarchy, the intelligence services, and a country watching the facade crack in real time. But with distance, what lingers is something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. The marriage itself ended in 2006 after a divorce process that Nos later described as turbulent and drawn out. Years afterward, Edwin de Roy van Zuydewijn was still speaking about the affair as something that had cost him the strongest years of his life. That tells you something important. For him, this was never only a media episode. It became the defining wound of his public identity. For Princess Margarita, the image that remained was more complicated. She did not stay frozen in that scandal forever. Life moved on. In 2023, Nose reported that she and her second husband, Jalling 10 Kate, had separated after 16 years together, describing the split as one made in friendship and centered on continuing as loving parents to their two daughters. The contrast matters. The first marriage ended in accusation, noise, and national fallout. The later separation was presented in a language of privacy, calm, and mutual respect. It is difficult not to see that contrast as part of the legacy of the first scandal. A life lived afterward with a sharper understanding of what public exposure can take away. And that may be the deepest loss in this story. Not only a marriage and not only trust, but the illusion that royal silence automatically means dignity, or that public revelation automatically brings truth. The AIVD later confirmed that information had indeed been gathered around the time of the intended marriage, while later reporting also made clear that the most dramatic allegation of wiretapping was not borne out as the couple had claimed. So the public was left where audiences often are in royal scandals, not with perfect clarity, but with fragments, contradictions, and a permanent sense that something important happened behind closed doors that was never fully resolved. Perhaps that is why the story still lingers, not because it offered a clean ending, but because it never did. What broke here was larger than a relationship. It was the belief that a family built on control could contain every fracture, and the belief that once the truth came out, it would arrive in one simple, final form. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and turn on notifications for more documentaries on the private fractures behind public lives.